I'm not going to deny that for years I fantasized about watching it all burn. Him, her, the whole family. But the fantasy of destruction has one problem. It doesn't build anything. Burns, sure. It flares for a second and then all it leaves behind is smoke and the smell of melted plastic. What I did wasn't just revenge. It was management. Of justice, of money, and of myself. I'm going to tell you this slowly, as if we were in a tiny kitchen in the middle of the night in Stockholm, with the yellow light on and the rest of the apartment in darkness. Me leaning against the counter, you sitting down listening. No interruptions. No embellishments. Just the facts. And what those facts did to my head. Back then, my name wasn't Hedda Persdotter. 14 years ago, when I still believed in the word family, as if it were a life insurance policy, my name was Lena. Lena something. The last name doesn't matter anymore. I married Johan on a cold October morning, in a church near Gamla Stan, with yellow leaves stuck to the wet cobblestones. Outside, tourists were taking pictures by the water, next to those colorful little houses that are on every postcard. Inside, I was saying I do. I was 24 and I thought love was a mix of sacrifice and patience. My mother taught me that. And my mother-in-law perfected it. Svea. Svea had that sharp voice women get when they've learned how to command without ever raising their tone. The kind of woman who walks into a room and drops the temperature by 2 degrees. Her perfume always smelled expensive and cold, and her house, out on the edge of Stockholm in an area where every house looks like a private clinic, was an extension of her. Everything in its place, everything white or gray, everything quiet. Johan was her favorite son, and to my misfortune, he was also her project. He worked in the family business, a factory that made metal components for the automotive industry, in an industrial park to the north, near a highway exit. Nothing glamorous. Low warehouses, containers, trucks coming and going, but the money was real, and I, naive, never thought to ask how much of that money was clean. The first time I realized something was wrong was one winter night, when we were still newlyweds. I was in our small apartment in Visastan, looking out the window at the snow sticking to the glass, blurring the streetlights. Johan came home late, his face tight and his shoulders rigid. "Everything okay?" I asked, turning off the TV. He dropped his keys on the table, downed a glass of water in one go, and sat down without looking at me. "My mother made a mistake," he said at last. "They made a very large investment. It didn't turn out the way they expected. She made a mistake." That's how he said it. As if she'd burned the bread in the oven, not as if he were talking about 150,000 euros. I only heard that number a few days later when there was no way back. What happened was this: Svea, through the company, had gotten involved in a supposedly safe deal, some kind of international logistics project. The classic story: promises of sky-high returns, inflated contacts, blind trust. But the reality was that half of that money never left shady accounts, and the other half was tied up with people who don't easily accept a "sorry, we made a mistake." I didn't understand investments yet. I was working as an admin assistant in a financial office near Hodergit, and every day I crossed Sergels Torg, watching the glass obelisk and the lights moving in circles over the black pavement. I'd look down at that square from above, from the railing, and think that adult life was that: people who knew exactly where they were going. I knew nothing. The debt belonged to the company, yes, but Johan worked for that company, and Svea was the one running it. And between those two, guilt hung in the air like a colorless gas, looking for a body to invade. I found mine. First came the hints. "You two are in a stable position," Svea said one afternoon, pouring my coffee into cups so thin I was afraid to hold them. "Johan tells me you're very organized with your money." I had some savings. Nothing extraordinary, but a fund I'd built up since I was 18, working, studying, saying no to trips, clothes, luxuries. 30,000 euros. Then my father died and left me a life insurance payout. Another 120,000. The only thing I felt when that money arrived was sadness, and a strange kind of guilt for still being alive. Your father would be proud to know his money is helping protect your family's future, she concluded, like she just read my mind. It wasn't immediate. There were weeks of conversations wrapped in concern, studied silences, and looks from Johan loaded with a mix of shame and pressure. He never said, "You have to do this." But every time we came back from Svea's house, the weight on his back seemed heavier. And I loved him. Stupidly, I loved him. In the end, I was the one who said out loud what they'd both been waiting to hear. What if I use my dad's insurance to cover the debt? I blurted it out one night on the couch, my feet under a blanket and my hands frozen. Johan looked at me as if an angel had suddenly descended from the ceiling. Are you sure? He asked, but the answer was already there in his eyes. I was sure of one thing. I didn't want to watch him go under. I didn't want to see him being hunted down, or see his mother losing the company, the house, the status. I thought we were a team, that if I put in my share, then later in the future everything would come back to us multiplied. I still didn't understand that some people only function if someone else is paying the price. I signed the papers on a gray Friday, in the office of a lawyer who checked the time every 10 minutes. The money left my account and went into accounts belonging to his family's company, like an emergency transfusion into a sick body. That day when I came home there were flowers on the table, a huge bouquet, and a note from Svea. Thank you for understanding what it means to be part of our family. She didn't use my name. That years later would matter. If I'm telling you all this in this almost clinical tone, it's because the pain has already passed through the fire and been reduced to a kind of cold coal. I can touch it now without getting burned. But back then, no. Back then, the wound was still open. The betrayal came fast. Almost elegantly. A month after the transfer, when I was still convincing myself that things were going to get better, Johan started coming home later. He changed his cologne. He changed his laughter. He laughed more at his phone than with me. I didn't ask much. Not out of trust but out of fear. Fear of hearing what I already suspected. The confirmation came from someone I never thought would be on my side. Iva, Johan's younger sister. Iva was the uncomfortable side of the family, the error in the equation. She wanted nothing to do with the company, lived in a rented apartment in Södermalm, worked as a freelance graphic designer, rode her bike even in November, with the freezing wind cutting her face. She was far too free by her mother's standards, far too blunt. She asked me to meet at a cafe near Medborgarplatsen, a place with worn wooden tables and plants in the windows, the sound of the metro rising from below like a constant murmur. I arrived with a knot in my stomach. She looked at me the way you look at someone who's about to crash into an invisible wall. Lena. She began, no small talk, no preamble. Johan is seeing someone else. I didn't believe her. Or I didn't want to. I know her, she went on. She works at the company. She's an accountant. My mother pretends she doesn't see anything, but she knows. And she's okay with it. The word okay hit me harder than the cheating itself. One thing is a man behaving like a coward. Another is an entire family signing off on it. That can't be, I whispered more to myself than to her. Iva laid her hand over mine. Her fingers were cold, but the gesture was warm. You need to see things for what they are, not for what you wish they were, she said. And you need to protect what you have left. At that point, what I had left was almost nothing. I'd given them my savings, my father's insurance, my time, my loyalty. What remained was a rented apartment and a dignity on shaky legs. I didn't make a scene. There were no screams, no broken plates. I confronted him one night in the kitchen, with the fridge humming low and the window fogged up. Is there someone else? I asked. Johan didn't even take 2 seconds to answer. That's what hurt the most. The speed. The absence of any fight. Yes. He didn't even try to deny it. Not a cheap performance. Just yes. Do you love her? I asked. I don't even know why. I don't know. But she makes me feel. He searched for the word. She makes me feel more aligned. Aligned. As if I were just a detour off his main road. And what am I then? I needed to know. He took his time, but not to think. To pick a word that would cut without getting his hands dirty. You're part of a stage, he said. An important one, but over. A stage that's over. Like a book packed away in a box. Like a scar hidden under clothing. Not long after came the conversation with Svea. I remember it as if I were watching a movie from the doorway. Her living room wide with big windows looking out onto a flawless garden. The sky white and washed out, typical Stockholm on a sunless day. She sat on a beige armchair. I was on the edge of a chair opposite, my fingers knotted together. Johan needs to move on, she said, with a tone almost therapeutic. You helped him through a very difficult time, and that will always remain in our memory. In our memory, not even in our hearts. Memory, a file, a footnote. But relationships change, she went on, and we can't force what's no longer there. What I remember most isn't what she said, but what she didn't. She never mentioned the money. She never mentioned the debt. She never mentioned the fact that, without me, her company wouldn't even still exist. The right thing, she added, is for each of you to follow your own path with maturity, without resentment. Johan will keep the apartment for practical reasons. You're young. You can rebuild your life. The apartment was in the company's name. I'd never noticed that detail. Everything, absolutely everything, was carefully arranged so that, when they let go of me, I would drop straight into the void. That night I packed a suitcase. Just one. A few clothes, my documents, a handful of photos. I left the plates, the glasses, the furniture, the bed where I dreamed up a life. I locked the door, left the keys on the kitchen table and walked out. No one stopped me on the stairs. No one ran after me. No one cried in the hallway. There was no drama. Just a silent expulsion. A clean amputation. Disappearing was easier than you think. Stockholm is a city that knows how to ignore you. With so many people in headphones, scarves up to their noses, grocery bags in hand and eyes on the ground because of the snow, one more person just dissolves. I changed neighborhoods. I moved into a rented room near Liljeholmen, looking out over a highway and a strip of gray water where the boats seemed frozen in place. I took whatever work I could find. Basic accounting, phone support, administrative tasks. Whatever came. And I studied. That was where the other story began. Hedda's story. Back at that financial office where I'd worked before, a few coworkers used to talk about investments like they were speaking some secret language. Funds, bonds, stocks, derivatives. I listened from a distance, curious, but never brave enough to ask. After the betrayal, I realized that, in the end, everything that had happened to me had a very specific root: ignorance. Not understanding how money moves had left me vulnerable. I had been raw material in other people's hands. I didn't want to be raw material ever again. I wanted to be an architect. I started taking night courses in finance, advanced accounting, investment analysis. First online, then in person. I'd ride the metro with my hair tied back, a notebook in my hand, surrounded by people younger than me or more sure of themselves. I'd arrive, sit in the front row, and take notes as if every word could become a brick in a new life. 4 years, my routine was simple and cold. Work, study, sleep. I went out rarely. I had no desire for bars, forced laughter, glossy success stories. What I was building was quieter. It was a discipline. Over time, I started to understand the game. How companies hid money, how they dressed up their balance sheets, how some foundations were, in reality, washing machines for capital. I learned to read between the lines of financial statements the way others read expressions on a face. And the more I understood, the clearer the moves of Johan's family became in retrospect. I learned, for example, that the donation the company made every year to a charitable foundation tied to Svea was not exactly philanthropy. It was an elegant way to move money, deduct taxes, and clean funds of questionable origin. Back then, I signed papers without questioning them. Today, I could dismantle them in an afternoon. And yes, I admit it. While I studied, a low, constant voice kept repeating in my head, "You will go back." Not out of hysterical hatred, but out of something colder. A kind of strategic justice. I didn't see myself throwing stones at their windows, but auditing their accounts. I didn't picture hitting them, but exposing them. 7 years after I disappeared, I was already someone else. On the outside, maybe not that much. Shorter hair, a steadier gaze. A couple of new lines near my eyes. On the inside, everything was different. By then I was working as an analyst at a small but ambitious investment firm, in a modern building near Kungsgatan. My name was on a card, my desk had 2 screens, my decisions moved money that wasn't mine. And for the first time I understood something that sounds obvious but that, in practice, almost no one accepts. Money is a tool of emotional power. Whoever doesn't control it becomes someone else's territory. That's when I got Iva's message. After years. A simple message, almost shy. "Can we meet? I have something to tell you." We met on a rainy autumn afternoon in a bar near Hornstull, with fogged-up windows and people working on laptops at tiny tables. Iva arrived in a dark green coat and deep shadows under her eyes. She sat in front of me, ordered a coffee, and looked at me like you look at a ghost who, against all odds, is still alive. "You look different," she said. "So do you," I replied. There was an awkward silence. Years had passed between us, but there was also an invisible thread. We had both been the loose pieces of that family, each expelled in her own way. "I was going to write you earlier," she confessed. "I didn't know how. I just froze. I didn't demand explanations. I wasn't there to collect a debt. Not from her." "What do you need to tell me?" I asked. Iva sighed. She looked around as if to make sure no one was listening, even though no one was paying us any attention. In Stockholm, people don't eavesdrop on other people's conversations. Everyone is busy carrying their own winter. "My mother. She started. The foundation." The foundation? Of course. Years ago, Svea had started a non-profit organization that supposedly helped women in vulnerable situations. She appeared in magazines, gave speeches, posed in photos with controlled smiles and a look that said, "I know what it means to struggle." I saw her sometimes on social media and felt sick. The world celebrated her as an example of leadership. I knew what lay behind that leadership, stepping on soft heads. "It's worse than you think," Iva went on. "I've seen documents. My mother uses the foundation to pull money out of the company, dodge taxes, and move funds into accounts in other countries. Johan signs without reading. He thinks it's just the way things are done." Didn't surprise me, but it's one thing to suspect. It's another to have someone in front of you with inside access, telling you the monster not only survived but grew. "And why are you telling me this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Because I'm sick of it," she answered. "Because, even if it's late, I feel complicit for keeping quiet. And because I thought," she looked straight at me, "that you'd know what to do with this information." Right there, in that sentence, something clicked. For years, all my effort to learn, to rebuild myself, to harden my mind, had had a vague, almost abstract goal. Never be a victim again. At that table, with the sound of spoons against cups and a thin thread of music in the background, that goal suddenly found a target. I didn't smile. I didn't make any dramatic gesture. I just nodded very slowly. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe I do know what to do." The birth of Hedda Persdotter was administrative. Legally, I mean. I consulted a lawyer specialized in identity, privacy, and protection. No, I didn't change my data illegally, but I did open a door the system allows: professional use names, registered pseudonyms, In the financial world, it's not unusual for some people to use a variant of their name for branding for security for whatever reason. The important thing is that it's traceable for the authorities, even if it isn't for the general public. Hedda Persdotter sounded solid, Nordic, neutral. And above all, it didn't sound like the woman who once laid her whole life on another family's table. I built the persona with discipline, new social profiles, new contacts, a resume that showed results, not wounds. I specialized in a specific area: corporate restructuring and investment advisory for foundations and organizations. It was an almost ironic twist, but a very strategic one. If I wanted to get close to Svea, I had to become something she respected, a useful expert. Iva was my bridge. For months, she played a delicate role. She talked to her mother about a brilliant consultant with a growing client portfolio who could help optimize the foundation's investments. Svea, like anyone who's spent their whole life airbrushing their image, was obsessed with the word optimize. It sounded intelligent to her, without sounding illegal. The first meeting was at the foundation's own headquarters, in a renovated building near Ostermalm. Clean facade, elegant logo, photos in the lobby of smiling women, children hugging donation boxes, charity events with glasses of white wine and sober dresses. I arrived in a dark suit, hair pulled back, a portfolio full of charts and projections. The first thing I noticed when I walked in was the smell of expensive coffee and disinfectant. The kind of cleanliness that never quite reaches what's truly dirty. Svea came out of an inner office. She looked almost exactly the same as the last time I'd seen her, just with more lines on her forehead and around her mouth. Her eyes traveled over my face, my clothes, my posture. She didn't recognize me. That was a strange blow. Freeing and sad at the same time. It felt like officially confirming my own death. Hedda Persdotter, she said, extending her hand. Pleasure to meet you, Svea, I answered, taking it. Her skin was still cold. We sat at a meeting table with a shiny surface. Johan wasn't there that day. I found out later he was traveling for the company. Good. For the first phase, I only needed her. I laid out a clean, basic analysis, apparently focused on maximizing social impact and ensuring the foundation's financial sustainability. All in a language she understood and knew how to recycle in front of journalists. But underneath, in the mental notes I was taking as I spoke, there was the other layer: gaps, inconsistencies, suspicious movements. I watched her eyes light up at very specific moments. When I talked about possible tax advantages, more flexible structures, opportunities abroad. She wasn't looking to help anyone. She was looking to keep moving money without getting her hands dirty. She accepted my advisory proposal. We signed a contract. From that day on, Hedda Persdotter stepped into the financial heart of her little fake empire. I won't lie to you. There were nights when my hands shook as I went through documents I would once have signed without reading. Now I dissected them like forensic reports. Inflated invoices for services that never existed, donations that went out and came back in disguise, fake salaries paid to people who never set foot in the foundation. And behind it all, the family company, the metal components factory, was still the source of a large part of the money. From the outside, everything looked flawless. Events with local politicians, features in newspapers, photos on social media. From the inside, it was a castle held up by creative accounting and sheer nerve. The interesting part, and in a way twisted, was that my revenge was built through leadership. Not the kind you find in self-help books, but the kind practiced in silence. Making hard decisions, standing by them, managing other people's fears and your own. Iva was key. She started saving copies of documents, internal emails, verbal instructions her mother gave her, still believing she was the obedient daughter. She recorded meetings. She archived everything in an encrypted digital folder. She passed me the information in brief meetings, sometimes walking along the canal in Sodermalm, sometimes sitting on benches facing the water at Normalerstrand, with the wind hitting us in the face. If my mother finds out, she'll kill me, she'd say, half joking, half serious. If your mother keeps going, she'll sink a lot more people, I'd answer. Including you. That was the other component of all this. It wasn't just about making them pay for what they'd done to me. It was also about stopping them from doing it to others. Women who believed they were receiving genuine help, factory workers who trusted the company was solid, minor partners who signed documents without reading. It took me almost 2 years to build the case. It's not like in the movies, where suddenly one incriminating email appears and everything collapses. In real life, especially in a country obsessed with order like Sweden, you have to build a complete legal narrative. Dates, numbers, responsibilities. It had to be so solid that, when we presented it, it couldn't be ignored. In the meantime, my relationship with Svea turned peculiar. She started to trust Hedda. She invited me to events. She introduced me as our strategic investment advisor. I would listen to her speak at small events, cocktail parties, conferences in hotels near the central station. She talked about resilience, about empowering women, about responsible leadership. Empty words, but delivered with a rehearsed conviction that fooled plenty of people. Sometimes at those events I'd see Johan in the distance. He had aged worse than his mother. Dark circles, a tighter jaw, a budding belly his suits tried to hide. He didn't look happy. He looked cornered. I didn't feel compassion. But I didn't feel satisfaction yet either. Revenge, when it's intelligent, doesn't chase immediate pleasure. It waits for the precise blow. There's one night in particular I remember clearly. It was winter. There was some kind of charity gala at a hotel by the water near Skepsbron. Ice floated in big dark slabs, and the city lights shattered on the surface in broken reflections. Inside, the heat was almost suffocating. People with glasses in their hands, sharp suits, discreet dresses. Svea was in her element. She moved between groups, touched shoulders, laughed at exactly the right volume. I followed a short distance behind, watching. At one point, she walked up to me with a glass in her hand. "Hedda," she said, "I want you to meet my son, Johan." I turned. I saw him walking toward us. For a second, I thought maybe he'd look at me and find something familiar in my eyes, in the way I stood. But no. He looked at me the way you look at any other professional in the room. "Nice to meet you," he said, offering his hand. "Likewise," I replied, taking it. His skin was warmer than his mother's, but his gaze was more lost. "Hedda has helped us a great deal with the foundation," Svea added, proud. "A true leader. Methodical, discreet." Methodical, discreet. I had never received a better compliment from someone I planned to destroy. The climax wasn't a single day, but a sequence of very precise days. First, the meeting with the tax authority. I didn't go alone. I went with a lawyer and with a dossier so thick it weighed in my hand like guilt made solid. We had proof of systematic tax evasion, money laundering through the foundation, diversion of company funds into personal accounts. In that white room with cold lights and functional tables, I didn't speak as a victim. I spoke as an expert. I presented data, dates, mechanisms. I didn't say, "They did this to me." I said, "This structure over these years has caused this damage to the system and violated these laws." I used the language the system understands. No tears. No shouting. Just numbers and consequences. After that came the contact with the press. That part was more delicate. We had to make sure the story broke at a point when they no longer had any room to move pieces around and cover up the scandal. We coordinated with a serious financial journalist, not a tabloid type. We gave him access to certain documents, with names still protected so as not to compromise the ongoing investigation. He smelled the story immediately. A respected business family, a model foundation, behind which a web of fraud was hiding. While all that moved forward in silence, I kept going to meetings with Svea as if nothing was happening. That was actually the hardest part. Holding the double life. Smiling when she talked to me about new deduction opportunities. giving her suggestions that were, in truth, legal traps designed to see how far she was willing to go. Johann, for his part, started watching everything fall apart without fully understanding why. I remember the call. I was in my own apartment by then in Kungsholmen, looking out the window at the dark water and the lit-up bridge. It was one of those nights when Stockholm feels silent down to the bone. The phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. Picked up. Hedda. Johann's voice on the other end sounded lower than I remembered. Yes, I answered neutral. It's Johann. I need to talk to you. I paused for a second, as if checking my schedule. Of course. What's going on? He took a few seconds. They're investigating the foundation, he said. The company too. They're saying there are inconsistencies. That someone reported us. And the documents, they're too precise. His mind was moving now, but far too late. I'll see what I can find out, I said. But if there are inconsistencies, Johann, the reasonable thing would have been to correct them before someone pointed them out. You don't understand, he snapped, with a tone that dragged me right back to that kitchen years ago. This is coming from inside. Someone who knows too much. Someone very close. I had to hold back a laugh. Not of mockery, of disbelief. They always talk about someone on the inside, as if the real problem were the betrayal, not the crime. My recommendation is that you cooperate, I replied. In these cases, fighting the evidence only makes things worse. We hung up with vague promises to stay in touch. Shortly after, the news broke. Articles on business sites, segments on TV, images of the foundation, of the events, of Svea handing over symbolic checks, now accompanied by words like evasion, fraud, criminal investigation. I'm not going to describe the entire legal process in detail. It was long, technical, full of appeals and maneuvers. What matters is the outcome. Svea was sentenced to prison for aggravated fraud and tax evasion. Not for everything she'd done, almost no one ever is, but for enough to topple the statue of the exemplary woman she'd built for herself. The foundation was taken over, restructured. Part of its assets were used, this time for real, to support realistic social projects under supervision. The family company got hit with massive fines. It lost contracts, suppliers' reputation. Johann, who had been signing without reading for years, was barred from holding executive positions for a period of time. His assets took a hit. The apartment where I once lived was seized and eventually sold. He lost almost everything. I say almost because he still had one thing left, the chance to understand. I don't know if he used it. The final scene, the one that stayed in my mind like the closing shot of a film, didn't happen in a courtroom or on the news. It happened in a small cafe near Odenplan. I was going over some documents for another client already, when I felt a familiar presence. I looked up. It was Johann. No suit. An old coat, a few days' worth of beard, deep shadows under his eyes. Can I sit? He asked. I thought about it for 2 seconds, then nodded. He sat across from me, studied my hands, my face. I didn't recognize you, he said at last. At first. At the gala. In the meetings. I never would have thought. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. It doesn't matter, I replied. He let out a short, dry laugh. Of course it matters. It was you. All this time. You were the one who, he searched for the words, the one who did this to us. He didn't say it with hatred, strangely enough. He said it with a mix of disbelief and something close to respect. No, I corrected him calmly. I didn't do this to you. You did it to yourselves. I just turned on the light. He fell silent, looked out the window. Outside, people walked past with hats, scarves, grocery bags in hand. Just another afternoon in Stockholm. You could have just left, he said after a while. Started over. Forgotten. I did leave, I answered. I did start over. I didn't forget. Was it revenge? The question hung between us. I took a sip of coffee, felt the bitter, roasted taste cling to my palate. In part, yes, I admitted. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But it was also consistency. I couldn't live with everything I knew and act like nothing was happening. Not after having been part of your system once. Not after paying the debt that saved your company. His eyes clouded over for a moment. The memory of the money I'd put in back then reached him late, like almost everything else. I never, he began. I never really thanked you for that. No, I said. You never did. And now it's pointless, he added. I looked at him in silence. Guilt has a thick gray color. There was a lot of that gray in his face. This isn't about you thanking me, I said finally. What matters is that you don't build your life again on someone else's sacrifice. He rubbed his forehead, exhausted. I've lost everything, he murmured. Not everything, I replied. You still have time to do something different with whatever's left. You sound like a coach, he tried to joke. No, I smiled just barely. I sound like someone who's already hit bottom and took notes. There was another silence, this one less tense. Did you ever love me? He asked suddenly, with that selfish cruelty of someone who still wants reassurance even in ruins. I looked him in the eye. I saw the man he'd been, the insecure boy craving his mother's approval, the adult hiding behind other people's decisions. I also saw the woman I'd been, young, naive, willing to give up everything. Yes, I answered. I loved you. A lot. And that was the problem. He nodded, swallowing hard. Then he stood up without rushing. I guess there's no point in asking for your forgiveness, he said. Forgiveness isn't for me, I replied. It's for you if one day you need it in order to move on. He paid for his coffee, made an awkward little gesture of goodbye, and left. I watched him walk away down the street, hunched inside his coat. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel sadness either. I felt something stranger, a kind of rough peace. With Iva, the story was different. She kept collaborating with the authorities, but her involvement was recognized as that of an internal whistleblower. With legal help, she avoided harsher criminal consequences. Her relationship with her mother, of course, was shattered. But she told me once as we walked over the bridge toward Sodermalm, the wind hitting us in the face. I'd rather be the honest traitor than the loyal rotten one. We laughed. That tired kind of laugh the body lets out when there are no more tears left to spend. Over time, we started seeing each other without talking about the family. Coffees, movies, conversations about work, love, projects. A strange friendship built on shared ruins. Sometimes I wondered whether in her eyes she saw Hedda or Lena. I think she saw both. And for the first time, that didn't bother me. I talked to you about leadership at the beginning. It sounds like a textbook word, I know. But for me, after all this, it means something very specific. The ability to steer your own life even when others have used you as currency. For years, my existence revolved around other people's decisions. Svea's investments, Johan's desires, the expectations of a family that only ever saw me as a resource. My big mistake wasn't loving. My big mistake was giving up the wheel. Hedda Persdotter's revenge wasn't just making them pay. It was taking back my place at the front of my own story. It was looking in the mirror and knowing that, for the first time, I wasn't letting anyone else manage my losses. These days I work with women who come to me with the same face I had years ago. Exhausted, confused, heart in their hands and bank account almost empty because of joint decisions they never really made. I don't promise them perfect justice. That doesn't exist. But I do teach them how to read contracts, how to ask uncomfortable questions, how not to sign in the name of love what they wouldn't sign in the name of logic. I talk to them about Svea without saying her name. I talk about Johan without naming him. I talk about Lena as if she were a client I once knew. And I talk about Hedda as a woman who one day stopped being raw material and learned how to be the architect of her own fate. Sometimes when I walk home through Kungsholmen, With the water on one side and the city lights trembling on its surface, I think about the girl who dragged suitcases down a staircase 14 years ago, expelled from her own life. Still hurts, yes, but it's an old hurt process that no longer rules me. I don't know if what I did was justice or just balance. I don't know if they deserved everything that happened to them, or if the universe simply made use of the evidence I laid before it. What I do know is this: I didn't save myself on the day they were destroyed. I saved myself on the day I understood that no family, no love, no promise is worth the price of abandoning yourself. And ever since then, even though winter in Stockholm is still long and dark, I sleep with the quiet certainty that, at the very least, the light guiding me is mine.